The Ukraine ceasefire comes under further strain as fighting between the army and pro-Russia militias intensifies in the country's east. Reports coming out of the eastern Ukraine say shelling in the region is raging on, with each side blaming the other for the violation of the Minsk truce. Several civilians have been killed in the crossfire. Kiev accuses Moscow of launching an offensive in eastern Ukraine, while Russia says Ukrainian forces are trying to push back the pro-independence fighters from their positions in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has strongly condemned Russia's, quote, aggressive actions in Ukraine.
The dire situation in eastern Ukraine is one that demands clear and strong condemnation of Russian actions. The United States stands with the people of Ukraine, who have suffered for nearly 3 years under Russian occupation and military intervention. Until Russia and the separatists it supports respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, this crisis will continue. Eastern Ukraine, of course, is not the only part of the country suffering because of Russia's aggressive actions. The United States continues to condemn and call for an immediate end to the Russian occupation of Crimea. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Our Crimea-related sanctions...
Haley added that American Crimea-related sanctions on Russia will remain in place until Moscow returns control of the peninsula to Kiev. Crimea rejoined the Russian Federation following a referendum in 2014. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says Kiev provoked the recent upsurge in violence to win the support of the new U.S. administration. Joining us now via Skype from Bristol is Tony Gosling. He's an investigative journalist. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Gosling. Now, I'd like to pick on the words that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said regarding the situation, saying that Kiev wants to win the support of the new administration and thus this ceasefire violation. What do you say to that?
Well, let's look at the context where Ukraine apparently swapped over from being friendly to Russia, friendly to the European Union and the United States and NATO. Because we've just had an announcement that NATO is going to be a referendum for the people of Ukraine to join NATO. And it's laughable that anybody could see the Russians as aggressors in this. I mean, we heard in that clip there that Crimea is part of Ukraine. Well, only in as much as Northern Ireland is part of the Republic of Ireland. Of course, you get certain parts of certain countries which really shouldn't be there, and the Crimea is part of that because the people who live there are ethnically Russian, they speak Russian, and it was really only in a Russian president's drunken night that this was handed over to Ukraine. So in a way, it's similar to what's happening here in Britain, because the taxes are being collected by Kiev right across, at least they were beforehand, the Donbass and Crimea, and yet the people in those territories were seeing hardly any of the money coming back to them. We're getting a similar thing now happening in Britain, with the money coming to local authorities, local government, going back less and less and less. And that's when people start to get agitated and want to secede from the centre, is when they're paying their taxes, but the money is then not being spent in their own country. Also, of course, the context of this is we've got this new Trump administration, and I think there's an attempt to try and set the new Trump administration as being very pro-Kiev, very anti-Russian, and to use this as an excuse. And actually, we've got a criminal government in Kiev that are allowing indiscriminate artillery attacks on the Donbass and on the Crimea. And something needs to be done about that, because the people in those territories don't want to be ruled by Kiev. That's absolutely clear in the referendums. And also, this is also all really about the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. If the West and NATO starts to control the Crimea, that means that the Russians won't have their Black Sea Fleet anymore, and it will severely curtail their ability to intervene in the Middle East to keep the balance of power. So it's a whole complex subject, but the West media has been appalling on this, has not really explained any of the basic things. They still talk about the idea of annexation of Crimea. Of course, it's nothing of the kind. The people of Crimea have voted overwhelmingly to be part of Russia.
Well, Mr. Gosling, then I guess the question is, what side would the U.S. pick? Now, Donald Trump has expressed his willingness to work with Russia. However, at the same time, he's also said that he will use American military might as a leverage in negotiations. Should he decide to side with Ukraine, he might go that way.
Well, I think that there will be a rapprochement. There is already a bit of a rapprochement with Russia. But there is also, of course, kickback. There's a bit of momentum amongst the old administration, the old military generals who nobody elects, etc., are eager to extend their territory. And that's, I think, what you've got going on here. The main problem, though, I think, is a psychological warfare one. It's like media wars. On one side of the divide, you get the media saying one thing, giving one interpretation night after night. On the other side, another. We've got a massive problem here in Britain. For example, the Russian Sputnik radio has been switched off in London. Nobody can listen to that anymore. Just a couple of weeks ago, switched off. Also, the new chairman of the BBC, Sir David Clementi, is not a programme maker. He's been appointed from the Bank of England, would you believe? And many say that they are a problem, you know, with all of the financial crimes that have just been let go. So, you know, the control of the press on this is absolutely crucial in trying to get one half of the world thinking one thing and one half of the world thinking the other. Here in the UK, many people actually do believe the propaganda. And so that's why it's so important to, you know, that stations like this are able to get out there and explain to people what's really going on. The Russians are definitely not the aggressors. If anyone looks at this dispassionately, you can see that NATO is desperate to keep this going. And they're doing this, I think, this attack on the Donbass at the moment in order to try and spike the guns of the new peace people at the White House. So to say to Donald Trump, we're carrying on with this, whether you like it or not.
Well, and before I let you go, Mr. Gosling, as you've just mentioned, there is this battle of perceptions over here. And if you look at the wider context, specifically after the election of Donald Trump, there was that term fake news that was floated around a lot, Russia being the aggressor over there once again.
Yeah, fake news, I think, is a rather pathetic attempt by the CIA and the intelligence people to accuse the people who are actually telling the truth. I mean, they do mix up a lot of fake news websites, but with the very good news websites. Of course, journalism should do the opposite. It should separate out the facts from fiction and from disinformation. But a lot of what the Western media are doing nowadays is deliberately mixing the two up. So they're saying some of the best websites in the world, like Michelle Chossudovsky's globalresearch.ca in Canada, is put in the same category as kind of completely made up clickbait stories. So this is really, I think, almost an admission, the whole fake news meme, which, by the way, came out in November last year in Berlin on the 17th of November, 2 days after Google had launched their anti-fake news apps. So in a way, it looks as if Obama and Merkel were just doing public relations for Google, promoting these idea that Google will tell you the truth. Well, of course, there's a lot of involvement within the NSA and the US security services in the formation of Google in the first place. And Google, for many people, I think we need to start seeing it as a kind of front end for the security services in America now.
All right, let's leave it there for now. That's Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us via Skype from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, it's always great having you with us here on Press TV.